The Betty-Ann and Wade Heggie Lectureship was established in 2008 to help bring high-profile, knowledgeable, and experienced scientists and practitioners to the college to address current topics in integrative medicine. Betty-Ann and Wade Heggie have been prominent members of the business and philanthropic communities in Saskatchewan for many years. They both had personal experience at leading integrative health centers throughout North America, and this lectureship is the way they have chosen to articulate their vision for integrative medicine in this province. I would like to also encourage you to use the chat box as we go for questions. I'm hoping we'll have roughly 10 to 12 or 15 minutes at the end. I'll be watching the chat box and trying to record some of the questions and themes as we go. Our speaker for today, Dr. Bonnie Kaplan, is from the University of Calgary. She's Professor Emerita in the Cummings School of Medicine. Her training was at Brandeis, University of Chicago, and Yale before she moved to Calgary. And her theme has been the biological basis of developmental disorders and mental health, particularly focusing on the contribution of nutritional factors to brain development and brain function. We're talking depression, anxiety, ADHD, and many others. And we know that depression is now, I think it has now become globally the leading health concern effect of the year 2020. And that's probably likely to continue for some years. She's won a variety of awards, including the Dr. Rise Prize for Lifetime Achievement in Integrative Medicine, and she was recently selected as one of 150 Canadian difference makers in mental health. Her most recent book is called The Better Brain, written with her colleague, Professor Julia Rutledge from New Zealand, recently published. And the central question that she's going to ask is, are people suffering from mental disorders, or is this really a nutrient deficiency? And if so, what might be the implications? Because there could be very, very far-reaching implications if we start making that distinction. I'm going to get out of the way, and it's my great pleasure, but I want to just say on a personal note, having known Bonnie for a little over 2 years now, she has been a huge inspiration for me, and I know for many others. And it's a great pleasure to see her doing what may be the most important and best work of her career in her mid-70s. So thank you, Bonnie, for being here. It's over to you.
Thank you so much, Michael. So you make me feel proud of my gray hair. What else can I say? I do want to start out by saying thank you first to Betty-Ann and Wade Heggie, who have had the foresight to recognize that integrative medicine, lifestyle medicine, whatever you care to call it, is the healthcare of the future. And I want to thank also the Alumni Association, Dr. Michael Epstein, and the other people at the Center for Integrative Medicine for inviting me to give this lecture. I stand on the shoulders of giants. Those of us who commit our lives to do research always stand on the shoulder of giants. So there have been many who have preceded me both in integrative medicine research, but also on this podium of the annual Heggie Lecture. So I'm quite honored that you invited me to do this. Now I'm going to pause while I share my screen and bring up my slides. Somebody let me know if they're having any trouble hearing me. I have a little bit of laryngitis. I think it's left over from the smoke, the forest fire smoke. We've had an awful lot of it here. Okay. Is the first slide showing right now?
I can hear you and see the slides, Bonnie.
Great. Okay. Thank you. So this is just who I am. The only thing you really need from this slide is if you want any other resources, videos, access to me, writing me an email, whatever. My website is my name, but Bonnie Kaplan's a very common name. So you need my middle initial. bonniejkaplan.com. Oops. It's standard to start out with the disclosure slide, and it's very important to me because many people have accused me of working for companies that make natural health products, and I've never been affiliated with any company and never will be. So this title question is meant to be provocative, of course, but you know, it's really a reasonable question. If you go back to when my grandparents were living, in fact, my father was born in 1910, and that's when the People's Home Library was the major resource for people who were homesteading on the prairies and down in the States on the prairie lands also. It was a 3-volume compendium that told you how to clean your house because you weren't living near your ancestors, your parents, who would teach you how to clean your house, how to make jam, how to take care of minor burns, how to take care of a fracture, tuberculosis, heart disease, you name it, and also mental disorders. Now, their terminology was different in 1910, but they said that the #1 cause of acquired insanity was imperfect nutrition. Go feed them better. And I don't think anyone thought anything of it because it had been known for millennia. And one of the things I enjoy doing but won't have time to do today is to go back 2,000 or 3,000 years to trace the awareness not only of the importance of our nutrition for mental health, but also the importance of having a healthy functioning microbiome, though they didn't call it that, in order to have good brain function. So it's a provocative question, but very reasonable given the history. This is an overview of what I'm going to be saying. Pardon me, I have to just move something on my screen because my slides are covered. For me anyway, maybe not for you. There. The first and most important thing I think that I want to do is convince you that nutrition is the foundation of mental health. And it's a curious thing to do because we accept it for physical health. We all know the importance of eating well for our physical health. So I'll be talking about why we should be including the brain. I'll say a few words about mechanisms and especially the implications for education, which is just really important. And I'll end with a few practical suggestions because I know I'm speaking to a lot of clinicians. Throughout this talk, I'm going to be trying to highlight the importance of this topic for saving families money and saving our budgets, our healthcare budgets. So for a couple of years now, I've been showing a slide like this and saying, isn't this terrible? Almost half of the caloric intake of all Canadians is from ultra-processed products. I mean, when you look at this slide, I don't know what vitamins and minerals you see, nothing in the donuts, the fries, and nothing. I hope you can see my cursor. Can you see my cursor as an arrow, Derek? Just checking.
I can
Anybody?
see it.
Okay, good.
See it.
That's what I'll use then. So there just aren't any good nutrients for your brain over here. There's a bit of iron and stuff here. I have no idea what's in hot dogs, so I won't comment. The point is, I thought 50% being coming from ultra processed food looked pretty bad. And then, this is from the Canadian Community Health Survey, by the way, cross Canada data. 2 weeks ago, this came out for the Americans. 2/3 of the caloric intake of young Americans is coming from ultra-processed products, and this was in JAMA. This next slide gives you the reference if you're interested in it. It covered youth aged 2 to 19 years, and it's part of the NHANES. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, and what they showed in 33,000 youth cross-sectionally collected across the country was that it's now gone up to 2/3 of the intake of our kids being from ultra-processed products. And I mean, my reaction is, what are we doing to our children? Because nutrition is the foundation of not only our physical, but our mental resilience. And now I'm going to show you why and how. First of all, do we know what happens to people whose nutrient intake is 50% of what it should or could be? Well, we do. You know, what is that old saying? You risk repeating history if you don't bother to look at it. Very few people know about this research, but these characteristics, and they are all the characteristics of depression and anxiety, and also some of ADHD, were shown to emerge in 36 normal healthy men who were deprived of half of their normal nutrient intake, also half of their caloric intake. So that's different from our children who are getting lots of calories, but not the nutrients. And this was part of the Minnesota starvation experiments published in 1950. They created mental illness. I could give you lots more examples of this, of inadequate nutrition predicting mental disorders. In other words, we know that the mental health impact of cutting nutrient intake by 50% can look a lot like anxiety, depression, etc. So I need to make a distinction here on a little, I try not to use a lot of terminology in talks like this when I don't really know who my audience is. But I do want you to understand how the terms macronutrients and micronutrients are used. Everybody agrees on what macronutrients are. And if you look at a label of a packaged food, you'll see fats, proteins, carbs, etc. Those are your macronutrients. And we could have a whole talk about how some carbs are better than others, some fats are better than others, etc. But it's not what I'm going to be focusing on today. The micronutrients, that term is not used universally the same way. So I need to tell you how I will be using it. And it's mostly to refer to minerals and vitamins, also some amino acids, you could say essential fatty acids, even though those are larger molecules and we need them in larger amounts, they are in this talk included as micronutrients. And this is a very important point. That's why I highlighted it in green. You can't find out how much you're getting most of the time. If you're buying your food in packages, you're lucky if you can find out about vitamin A, C, potassium, calcium, and iron. But there are roughly 15 vitamins and 15 minerals that we need to be aware of, and I'll be showing you why, plus the essential fatty acids, amino acids, etc. That's not even getting into the 1,000 phytonutrients, but just keeping it to what we know in terms of brain function. So it's hard to know what you're even getting when you eat a packaged product. So let me now show you a little bit of the data. I could talk for a half a day just reviewing the data. Instead, I wrote a book, but I mean, I'd like to be showing you a little bit of the data to convince you that how we eat predicts how vulnerable we will be, how much our risk is for developing mental disorders. So I picked, there are a zillion correlational studies. There are a few predictive studies like this, and I picked one which is both Canadian and about children, published in Pediatrics just 2 years ago, and it was carried out by a group of scientists from the University of Alberta and the children, and also from Nova Scotia. The children were in Nova Scotia. So here's what they did. In 2011, they evaluated over 3,000 children aged 10 to 11, according to 9 health recommendations. 6 of them were on dietary intake, and you can guess what kinds of questions they were, like how many sodas did you have this week? How many times did you eat at a fast food restaurant? So 6 health recommendations on dietary intake. Then the other 3 were on screen time and physical activity, okay? Then they came back. In 2014, they pulled the administrative health data and they asked the question, which of the children had been referred to a physician for assistance with an emotional mental health problem? Interesting question, right? And this is what they found. And Dr. Paul Voiglers, who's the senior scientist, actually made up these next 2 slides for me to be able to simplify the central message. That if you look just at these 6, remember 6 of them were dietary recommendations. And notice the y-axis is not, there's no quantification. It's kind of a cartoon in that way, but setting this as the amount of need for mental health services for children who followed only 1 or 2 of the recommendations, they asked the question, how much were the other children who were following more of those 6 dietary recommendations, how much more were they protected, if at all? And indeed, as you can see, there was a significant drop in the proportion of those children who were referred for mental health treatment. And then if you put all 9, even though I'm talking only about nutrition, I mean, all of these lifestyle variables are just so important. So this is the slide showing all 9 of them. Pardon me, am I supposed to be watching the chat at all? It says there's music in the background. I don't know where that's coming from.
Yeah, don't worry about the chat, Bonnie. We'll monitor the chat for you.
Okay.
But if everybody can remember to mute their microphones, with the exception of Bonnie, that would be much appreciated. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So as I was saying, if you look at all 9 of the lifestyle variables, you can see that those who were following 4 to 6 or 7 to 9 had an even bigger reduction in the need for mental health services. And then they did one more thing, which I think is very important for us to pay attention to. They did a regression analysis where they asked how, could they predict risk based on these these health recommendations. And they found that every additional recommendation that was met was associated with 15% fewer physician visits for mental problems, okay? And I put the dollar signs there for obvious reasons. I mean, this is not only a matter of reducing suffering of children and burden on families, it's also a matter of saving money in our healthcare budget. This is pretty important to keep in mind because we have this incredible epidemic of mental health problems going on right now. And yes, some of it is because we have more DSM categories than we ever had before. And yes, some of it is because people are more forthcoming and looking for help, and we don't want to discourage that. But I think most of us think that this magnitude of change can't be explained by those variables completely. So E. Fuller Torrey, some of you will recognize his name, and Judy Miller wrote The Invisible Plague because they were horrified to discover that they collected data from all over the world prior to 1750, compared it to the prevalence rate of diagnosed mental illness in 1960 and said, look at this, it's tripled. We have an invisible plague. I wonder what they think now. World Health Organization says point prevalence is 20% and lifetime prevalence is 50%. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I think that is crazy. It shouldn't be like that. And by the way, what happened after 1960? That's the psychopharmacology revolution. That's when all of our conventional treatments really got going. And you heard about some of that this morning. The take-home message from all this bad news is that mental health problems are just huge. I don't know if you like the word epidemic or not, but they're really an enormous burden on families, on societies. If conventional treatments were sufficient, I happen to think all the conventional treatments are worth keeping, but if they were sufficient, shouldn't the rates be going down? But nutrition should be part of the conventional treatments, I think, and it is being ignored. That's why I'm talking to you today about that. I want to talk to you about the relevance of brain function. And this may be a review for many of you because you're all medical school graduates, I assume, or most of you. But a lot of people do not know this. You know that our brains are very tiny. They account for about 2% of our body weight. You may not realize, however, that they are the greediest little organ in our body. I think cardiologists sometimes say the heart is, but let's, call it a draw. They're both really demanding oxygen, nutrients, etc. So that little tiny organ is pulling much more than its weight, like 10 times in terms of the proportional needs for metabolism. And here's another way to look at it that I find a lot of people find kind of amazing. Each of us has 4 to 6 liters of blood inside of us. An entire liter passes through that little tiny 2.2, let's call it a kilogram, 1 kilogram organ every 60 seconds, carrying nutrients and oxygen. Especially, it's doing other things, of course, it's taking away waste products, etc. But you should ask yourself, what are you feeding your brain every minute of every day? This is an interesting question to me. Why have we evolved to need so many nutrients every minute? And it really boils down a lot to brain metabolism. And again, I know you know some of this, but I'll just to fill in the story for you, just remind you that metabolism is the transformation of one compound to another. Most of our metabolism, if not all, is enzymatic. So to get from chemical A to chemical B, you need an enzyme. But that enzyme cannot pull its weight, cannot do its job efficiently, unless it has an abundance of cofactors, minerals and vitamins. And this little piece is what I wish were taught in elementary school, high school, certainly in medical school, because it seems to have been forgotten even at that level. I've had physicians ask me whether minerals and vitamins were important for brain function. That's why I say that. So this is a slide that I've been showing for 15 years, not 50 years. Michael, even I am not that old, okay? Lifestyle can only do so much, right? For 15 years, because everyone, after I explain it, even lay audiences, tell me that this is their aha moment when they realize what nutrition is doing for their mental function. This is, you'll recognize a tiny, tiny little piece of tryptophan to serotonin metabolism. Tryptophan, serotonin, and melatonin are in red only because everybody knows, recognizes those names, and I'm often speaking to lay audiences. There are lots of other chemicals here, and what you need to know is that every arrow is an enzymatic transformation. This is a piece of metabolism, and you can ask the question, what micronutrients are needed for the cofactors to make that happen. So you can click on the arrows online and you find a lot of minerals, you find a lot of vitamins, you find vitamins and minerals working together, you find some trace minerals that some people have never even heard of, like molybdenum, zinc, iron, niacin, etc. And every single step is dependent upon abundant availability of those cofactors. And I made this up and I swore I would never give a lecture again without showing it because I get such amazing feedback on it. But my colleague at Oregon Health and Science University, Dr. Jenny Johnstone, wanted to make the point in one of the talks that we were giving together that she thought people were taking away, maybe it's only relevant to serotonin, but of course that's not the case. So she did one in a circular format for dopamine. And again, you see vitamins and minerals every step of the way. And that's what are needed. That's what you need as your cofactors. So the bottom line is that the role of nutrients in brain function is not a mystery. Metabolism, nutrients are cofactors. I don't have time to talk about mitochondrial function, but you need these cofactors to produce ATP. ATP production is our primary internal ability. It provides us with the ability to fight excessive inflammation. And if you're eating properly to produce ATP and feed your gut, you're feeding the healthy gut bugs. And if anyone wants to see how all of this fits together, ask me for that article. So the good news is that diet is a modifiable risk factor. And that means that you physician clinicians should be paying attention to it. And I'm sure you are. I'm sure you're talking about it with all your patients, particularly for physical health. Maybe after this talk, you'll mention mental health. There are two types of research that I want to just mention. There are so many studies now. I mean, the evidence base is vast, peer-reviewed studies in major journals, but they fall into two groups. I'm going to say something about whole of diet treatment and then nutrients in capsule form. So this is I took two studies and put them on the same slide. Both of these groups both happen to be in Australia, but they didn't work together, both published in 2017, as you can see in good journals. And both of them took people with major depressive disorder and a poor diet and randomized them to either get 12 weeks of dietary counseling or peer support. And here were their findings in a nutshell. This is an important finding. Even with depression, diet modification is possible. That's important to me because I've had physicians, well, psychiatrists particularly, say to me, I work with really depressed people. They don't have the ability or energy to change their diets. And I don't think that's true. Remission, 8% of those who receive peer counseling. Those of you who do therapy need to know that. you are having an impact. That's very important. 32% of those who received dietary counseling went into remission in less than 12 weeks. That's from the SMILES trial. If anyone knows of an antidepressant which has ever resulted in a 32% remission rate with no side effects in 12 weeks, please email me, because I keep saying to people that there are no antidepressants to do that. And those whose diets improved the most showed the most improvement in mood. And this is a very important finding. And this is also from Jacka's SMILES trial. Prior to intervention, people were paying about $138 Australian per week to buy processed food, and the recommended diet was less expensive. And we have to dispel the myth that eating a whole foods diet must be more expensive. It doesn't have to be, and I'll show you how on this slide. This is, you'll recognize a lot of you as basically a Mediterranean whole foods kind of diet. So up here you have lots of fruits and vegetables. Here you have fish, meat, assuming you're not a vegetarian, dairy and eggs, whole grains for your carbs, olive oil when possible, lots of nuts and seeds. And this is where you save money. You can buy dried beans and lentils and peas for pennies a day for your family. If you want to buy them in cans, rinse them off to get rid of the excess sodium, it's still very inexpensive. You can put something like, say, kidney beans into Google and say recipe for kidney beans, and you'll have something like 7 million at least recipes in less than 1 second. And I'm not saying everybody should start eating beans and legumes every night. That's ridiculous. But if you gradually introduce these things into your diet, and if you're not trying to eat a Mediterranean diet based on steak and lobster, you will find that you're saving money. So you need to tell your patients, yes, they can afford to eat that way, because this way is expensive. The people who are eating this way are also buying from vending machines and places like that and corner stores. This is a very expensive diet. Okay, I have to move on with the research. What about your patients who already eat a really healthy whole food diet? Is nutrition relevant for them? So again, I apologize, I don't have time to go into this in detail, but I just want to give you the topics. You can read on my website or in our book about it. We go into them in detail. The fact is that a good diet might not be sufficient for optimal brain function for everyone. We know about individual differences in the need for cofactors. And I mean, it was Linus Pauling in the 1960s who said that's probably the basis of mental illness, why it runs in families. Do you ever wonder about that, why it runs in families? It may be because in some families there is an inherited need for a different level of cofactors. And then for all of us, the second thing, we have a half a chapter just on the problem of the impoverished soil, which is of course where we get our vitamins from healthy plants that have been able to absorb the minerals from the soil. And that's something we all, as just people living on this earth, have to become more educated about. So I'm not going to go into those two areas any further. I want to show you an overview of the research using nutrients in pill form. And they fall into 3 categories. And I'm going to, when you'll be happy, I'll tell you to ignore one of them so we can simplify this talk, okay? The category to ignore is single nutrients. People who believe in magic bullets for brain health they're wasting our tax money. If you have students who want to study one nutrient at a time, they're wasting their time and effort. You're not going to have any, I mean, just think about those metabolic pathways. And yet that's where all the funding from the government agencies go. Oh, vitamin D might help with depression. Let's study that. Oh, omega-3s might help with depression. Let's study that. But they work together. So really, the research from all the single nutrient studies going back to about the 1920s, which I reviewed in a paper I can send you if you want to read it, they're just of minimal impact. There were some interesting clues there, but that's all. But if you want to really help people, you've got to look at either the favorite few or broad spectrum. Most of the studies on what I call the favorite few are some researchers saying, oh, I'm really interested in this vitamin and that mineral. Let's do a study of these 4 or 5 or whatever. That's a waste. But the B complex, the people who've taken all the B vitamins and studied those for stress are really onto something. And I'm going to show you on the next slide some information on that. And then the other area where there are about 50 peer-reviewed articles are the ones that, and all, really a very tight case with replications and randomized controlled trials. Those give all 30 minerals and vitamins that we should be getting from our food. So here's the B complex slide. There are at least 8 randomized controlled trials which have shown that B complex decreases stress and anxiety, but not in clinical samples. It improves resilience, but there is not a shred of evidence that it's going to really help with someone who has an anxiety disorder, something serious enough to be a diagnosable anxiety problem. I haven't even heard anybody say anecdotally that B complex had helped one of their patients, in that situation. But in a crisis, in periods of stress, kids who are going through exams, and I'll show you, I hope I'll have time to show earthquakes and floods. How am I doing on time? Okay. There is good data there. But it's the broad spectrum formulas which have been studied by scientists who reject any money from any of the natural health product companies. That's what I mean by independent. Those studies have really shown the best results. And 2 of the 3 were developed in Alberta, and yet most of you probably haven't heard of them. So I give you the websites here. The first 2, the reason they're both from Alberta is they start out as one company, True Hope, and then they split into, and so now we have Hardy Nutritionals. And so their broad spectrum formulas are somewhat similar. And then there's a kind of a specialized group, Jim Adams and his group down at Arizona State Autism Nutrition Research Center. I did mention here that there are 2 really good studies in Europe, and they used a broad spectrum, but neither one of them used something that could be studied repeatedly. I mean, you have to have a product that everybody is studying virtually the same thing, or you can't compare the data, and that hasn't happened there yet. So what those 3 have in common, I kind of said this already, no one who has studied any of those 3 have ever gained financially from them. Each formula has approximately 30 minerals and vitamins, all have been shown in multiple studies, including randomized controlled trials, that they improve mood regulation. But the third one from Arizona is kind of a specialty area, people with autism. This is a summary slide. Now I need to mention Dr. Julia Ruckledge, who I think Michael mentioned Julia in the introduction. Julia is originally a Canadian, and she did her master's and PhD with me, but not on nutrition. We were into other things back then. Then she went to University of Canterbury in Christchurch, New Zealand, and has been there ever since. And she has had the most active research program on the Alberta formulas of anybody in the world. And she put together this summary slide recently because and she's my co-author on the book, The Better Brain. So we both reached a point where nobody wants to hear us talk for an hour and a half. Why did I just get a message saying participants can now see my screen? I think you've been seeing my screen all along, I would hope. Okay, I'm going to trust that you're seeing it, or somebody would be talking to me and saying, where are you? So anyway, Julia put this together because we can no longer show this many studies in a single talk. And the way to look at this, we were trying to grasp an overview of what have the clinical trials shown. So these are only the randomized controlled trials. Sometimes they're placebo controlled, and in some situations where you cannot use a placebo, they're using an active comparator. So the way to read it is here, like on aggression. There have been 5 peer-reviewed RCTs, and all 5 of them showed benefit of the active over placebo. That's what we mean by a positive trial. And there's the autism group, addiction. There's just a little there. Mood, stress, ADHD. We now have really excellent studies on those. The common theme across all these diagnoses, by the way, even if it's a diagnostic category like ADHD, are these trans diagnostic or symptoms of irritability and emotion dysregulation, explosive rage, whatever. Those are the symptoms which are so quickly and most easily remediated. Not in everybody, because there's no magic here, and not everybody responds positively, but it is where the most benefit is found. And so 82% of the trials so far have been positive, and I'll be giving you some references for that. I put together with Julia a summary slide that I think really shows the potential for benefit. And I'm going to end on a critical note about our governments, but let me show you what the data showed first. Okay, so this is about earthquakes, a flood, and massacres. So moderate stress, mild stress, normal stress on the y-axis. And these are the different studies. And as soon as I put the first one up, you'll understand how this is set up. This is what happened from baseline to all the endpoints are 4 to 6 weeks. In a group of people after one of the Christchurch earthquakes, remember from 2010 to 2011, they had terrible earthquakes there. They interrupted Julia's research and then she ended up studying it. So this is a randomized controlled trial. And the people who were getting them, one of the Alberta formulas, this is how they decreased within a few weeks. And that's a very large effect size for all of them. We then replicated that in the flood that happened in southern Alberta. That was in 2013. And the amazing thing to me is that the earthquakes, you know, they had 8,000 aftershocks over 5 months. We had one flood in one day, and yet we got the same results. And we had a smaller sample too, but this is the group that got the active formula. This is what happened after the 2 Christchurch mosque massacres that happened a couple of years ago. These were not from a randomized trial. She did not go to ethics committee. That the city of Christchurch was devastated by what had happened when a white supremacist guy went in with a gun and killed a lot of people. And the survivors were terribly traumatized. And I think every time I show the slide to Americans, I say, you guys have this almost every day. You should be concerned about mental resilience. At any rate, she did this in a clinical kind of context and volunteer context. And what she showed was exactly the same thing in terms of, I forgot to define this, that's the depression, anxiety, and stress scale, okay? Then this is what happened in the earthquake with the comparator group, which was conventional psychiatric treatment. And this is what happened in the flood, which was conventional psychiatric treatment or vitamin. We had an active comparator of vitamin D. And this is the cutoff for normal versus clinical range stress. So what we have here is remarkable consistency across 2 countries, across 3 different kinds of traumas. And so then we're going to get negative here. In 2016, we had the Fort McMurray fires in northern Alberta. Some of you probably remember that. It was quite devastating. We had over 90,000 people displaced. So armed with this information, I went to the mayor's office. I went from there to the emergency medical center. From there, I was sent to Alberta Health Services because they said they don't touch anything like pills. Went to Alberta Health Services. From there, I was sent to psychiatry, and psychiatry said, no, we're not interested in anything nutritional, not even data-based, but we'll check with the dietitians. And the dietitian said, oh no, we'll just put it in our pamphlet to tell people to eat better. These are people who didn't have their kitchens anymore to cook. But anyway, this is what happened. I purely by chance happened to see the data on the Alberta government webpage for mood disorders. That's the green line, anxiety disorders. I don't think we can talk about substance abuse in the same way, but those 2 curves, obviously they were going up before the fire. And this is what happened with conventional treatment after the fire. And that makes me want to cry because I don't know how to get through to the policymakers who could be influencing people's mental health. So I'm going to end with the practical suggestions, which are what you folks could be doing, okay? And I give you my website again. I think people should focus on the importance of real food first. Not restrictive specialty diets. There are people who feel better on these diets, no question, but a lot of people find them too restrictive. And so they fail and they say, food, I can't deal with it. I can't change my diet. It would be much better to start out with teaching people how to get off of processed food and eating a whole foods diet and the importance for their brain health. And then if they want to later, try a gluten-free diet, a paleo diet, whatever. This might sound patronizing, but I've had physicians say to me that they don't feel comfortable saying to their patients, tell me how you eat. It feels like maybe because they know that they don't eat optimally either. So they feel a little uncomfortable. So I give you a little script. There's an increasing amount of scientific data showing that what we eat influences how we feel. Let's talk about your diet. Seems to be a non-threatening way to do it. And then where do you go from there? Well, Amy Paxton published a Start the Conversation series of articles. This is an adaptation. Just 4 questions that you could ask people. There's no right or wrong. It's not for scoring, but I think you usually find when you ask about fast food, sodas, fruits, and vegetables, people start volunteering things like, well, I eat plenty of fruit, but I should work more on my vegetables, or, well, what do I do about sodas, or whatever. You will engage them in conversation. Another practical suggestion, I think every mental health setting, every family practice, every elementary school, and certainly, please, every medical school could educate about nutrition and mental health. I think in a clinic, I think it's pre-treatment for every mental health referral. Educate about whole foods, about what the brain needs. Teach about cofactors. Cofactors is a very simple concept. Once people get that, they'll understand. Maybe offer cooking classes. Teach people how to save money with an Instapot or whatever, and learning about beans and legumes. Share recipes. There are lots of ways to move forward there. And I'm going to end by giving you some resources and open it up for questions. So these are 3 recent articles, and I could send these to anyone. This one, Julia and Jenny, I've mentioned them both, pardon me, and I published recently in American Psychological Association journal, and it's been really widely in demand. So we're quite thrilled. It's written for clinicians that nutrition provides the essential foundation for optimizing mental health. Everything else that's done is worthwhile too. I mean, even, I hope nobody ever paints me as being anti-medication. If you read chapter 12 of our book, you'll know that we see medication as being very useful for many people. It saves lives. So how can you be anti-medication? But we just think it should be the second step or the third step, not the first step. Nutrition should be the first step, especially for our children. What are we doing to our children? Okay, another study or a publication that may interest you if you want to see all the massacre, earthquake, and flood data put together. Julia and I and our colleagues published that recently. These are all 2021, I think. And then Julia and Jenny, with their colleagues, did a systematic review, if you're interested in systematic reviews and meta-analyses of the randomized controlled trials. Oh, that was 2020. Finally, some of you probably know about Moocs. That's mass open online courses. And if you go to edX.org, you'll see 1 million of them. If you want to find the one that Julia Ruckledge has put together, it's very good. It's free. Just search for her name. And I'm one of the people interviewed there, but other people are too. And she makes it fun, lots of videos and so forth. And people of all kinds of backgrounds have been watching that from around the world. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm just going to end by saying a couple more things before I turn it over to the rest of you. So I gave you the further resources on that. One other thing happened last week, and I haven't had time to turn it into slides. I just want to tell you, it's a real breakthrough. I mean, it's been a little frustrating to us. People ask me why Julie and I wrote a book. Frustration has to be right at the top of the list, getting the word out. But for the first time, a randomized controlled trial was published in the Journal of the Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. Jenny Johnstone at Oregon Health and Sciences is the principal investigator. The other two sites, one is at Ohio State and one is at University of Lethbridge. So it's multi-center, multi-country, and it's a replication of Julia Rutledge's studies. And what it looked at is the impact of one of the Alberta formulas in children with a diagnosis of ADHD and also mood dysregulation. And just roughly speaking, those, when they broke the blind at the end, they found roughly 54%, I think, of the children who got the real formula were not just improved, but in the very much improved category, and only 18% who got the placebo. So the split between the placebo and the micronutrients was very strong. And it's called the MADI trial, Micronutrients in ADD Youth. And the MADI trial is going to generate quite a few studies if you keep your eyes open for that. I can send that out to people, but it's very exciting to break the glass ceiling of that journal. And now I'll conclude with a request. My personal goal is to influence policy. Now, we have over 40 people on this program right now and people watching it recorded. If you have contacts in government health departments, in mental health delivery systems, if I can help in any way, please contact me. That's why we wrote the book. It's not, I don't recommend it as a retirement activity, but if you want to change something, you have to reach the general public, and this is written for the general public. So that's my goal. I'm not anti-medication, anti-anything else, but nutrition is the foundation of how our brains and bodies work. And I think people are more likely, there are a zillion nutrition books out there, but we're the first one to tell people why they should change the way they eat. And we explain it in a way that people understand. I would like to get that message to the policymakers, and I hope to hear from at least 5 of you with ideas about how I could do that. So I'll be happy to answer questions now. Do I turn this back to Derek or Michael? Somebody's going to start talking.
I'll try to moderate here if anybody can hear me. Can you hear me, Bonnie?
Yes, I can. Thanks, Michael.
Okay. And I would encourage, we have over 100 people apparently watching, and here comes a question. I'm just going to keep an eye on these. If anybody would like to share questions on the chat box, this one's a suggestion, I guess, that I'm seeing there. I got to say, Bonnie, first off, that was an incredibly lucid clarity. It was just so well focused. I had 5 questions ready, but you've already answered all of them.
Oh.
So, but I'll just, the themes that you've touched on, I think might be worth just mentioning. The importance of getting to policymakers. You've said that again and again. The second thing that is really, I think, hard-hitting for me is the readiness of children to take the lead on this. And the idea of getting this into the elementary schools or even into kindergartens. When you look at that, you call it the AHA, magic moment video with the metabolism arrows and so forth, and the cofactors. It seems to me you could make, or children could make their own, a children's video or a little game for children or something like that. I can see enormous possibilities of getting this into the schools. So that's just another thing that you touched on.
I'd love to do that. I just want to mention twice I've been able to address children in grade 6. They got it, no problem. Just thought I'd mention that. Michael, while I've interrupted you, there is one question about the Alberta formulas. I need to, how do you access them? I have post-traumatic something or other from 100,000 accusations that I'm affiliated with these companies. And so I do everything I can not to mention any company's names because it's part of my staying arm's length away from anything commercial. But I wasn't ever going to make a formula. You got to have a formula to study, right? So I gave you their websites and I call them the Alberta formulas because they're both from Alberta. Okay. But one is from truehope.com and the other is hardynutritionals.com.
Dr. Blackshaw has just commented about converting to a vegetarian diet, how cheap it was. And I just want to underscore, in my graduate student days, I found the same thing. I found I could eat, and again, the base of all of this was often pulses.
Yes.
I could eat the very best organic food and it would cost a fraction of what I'd been spending previously. We have a question from Dr. Dee Dee Maltman. Could you please share the story, Dr. Megan Rodway, and the financial story as well?
Thank you, Dee Dee. That's a great and true story. And I think you know Megan Rodway. I'll try to make this short. Dr. Megan Rodway was the head of the outpatient child and adolescent psychiatry clinic here. When I knew her, she actually used to be a neighbor and I knew her slightly there, but I wasn't really dealing with her or interacting with her professionally. But one day I got a phone call from a family, a mother, very timidly asking me if I would go with her to Dr. Rodway to see if Dr. Rodway would be willing to use, at that time it was just True Hope, the True Hope formula for her son. She was afraid to raise it with Dr. Rodway. And there's a message here, folks, because there are psychiatrists who back then anyway, I hope there aren't any left now, who say, if you take vitamins and minerals, I will never see you. Don't come back to see me. I don't want to treat you. And so this mother was terribly afraid. She felt very dependent on Dr. Rodway's treatment. And in a nutshell, the reason why is, and we tell the story of, we call him Andrew in our book, that's not his real name. And Andrew had been the sickest child ever seen as an inpatient at Alberta Children's Hospital in the inpatient mental health unit. He had hallucinations, delusions, severe OCD diagnosis because he was convinced that he had committed adultery. He was convinced he had committed murder. Did I say he was only 10 years old at that time? And so he would pray incessantly. And this is not a family of religious fanatics. Who knows where it came from? At any rate, and he also became convinced his food was poisoned. He wouldn't eat. It was just a horrendous situation. The inpatient people tried him for 6 months on every medication, couldn't solve the problem, sent him home, sent him to outpatient. And so that's when the mother called me and said, please, we don't know what else to do. We want to try him on this formula. And so this case study is published. What happened was Dr. Rodway said, basically, she had the integrity to say, I think this is snake oil, but I don't have anything better to offer. They already tried everything when he was an inpatient. So the family worked with her, they put him on the formula, and I kept track of the data, and we published that as his hallucinations and delusions and OCD went pretty much to zero. But now that was, in 2009, it's like more than 10 years ago. He remains free of those symptoms as long as he takes his pills. He has to, but he still has some residual anxiety. And there are some other things about him. But the interesting thing about Dr. Rodway was she said, this is important to pursue. And she left Alberta Health Services and the university. She went to the University of Arizona program, the Center for Integrative Medicine, took their 2-year fellowship in integrative medicine and became a certified integrative physician here in Calgary, psychiatrist. So that's the story. Did I leave out anything that you, oh yeah, in the publication, Dee Dee, right. we calculated the 6 months of some of the costs when he was an inpatient and the 6 months immediately afterwards. A health economist was our co-author and did that. And the cost in the 6 months afterwards was about 3% of what the inpatient cost was. 3%. Think if even 1 out of 10 patients could be treated this way. And we've published one other case, by the way, an adult in terms of, and it was also less than 10%. So we can save provinces a lot of money if they would pay attention to our data.
I'm going to throw out a question here. Again, another theme that you've alluded to repeatedly has been resistance to change.
Right.
In various forms, from various directions, at various times and places. And I guess my question is, I'm sure you have many, many, many stories, but any lessons that you've learned about your experience in identifying and dealing with resistance to change, and any advice that you might have for young researchers who may be wanting to take on contentious or controversial or unpopular topics?
Well, number one, develop a thick skin. Number two, it kind of helps to be below the radar by living in a country like New Zealand, because Health Canada and the FDA were very challenging to deal with. But the most recent Maddie trial is fully approved by both Health Canada and FDA. So, we've made progress there. For young researchers, if you're interested in this topic, come see me and email me, and I'm going to tell you why. If you have a student who's interested in this, right now, the way things stand is that, and you've given me an opportunity to mention something that might sound tangential, Michael, but cut me off if you don't want to hear it. There are a lot of obstacles to doing research sometimes, and certainly government slowness to accept it and approve things. That's one of them. But money is one of them. And another is finding skilled, well-trained principal investigators, PIs. Where we stand right now is that we need more PIs who are willing to study this. There was a time 5 years ago when I was very worried that we were losing some, and I set up charitable funds. I have 2 donor advised funds, one in Canada, one in the US. And in the last 5 years, I've raised about $900,000, treating the Canadian and US dollar the same. And that money is all distributed. So for example, a couple $100,000 went to the Maddie trial, for example. Some has gone to New Zealand, some to another researcher. But I am still, receiving donations. I'm open to donations if any, but this is not a plea for donations. It's a plea for scientists. We have to get people who are willing to do more research in the area. However, clinicians, you have an enormous role too. We now have we have enough exact replications that we would meet FDA requirements for market approval, right? But nobody wants FDA approval that's not what we're seeking. We want to get into clinics. We want clinics to take the evidence base that is already there and apply it. And then maybe some students could evaluate those new programs. Michael, you asked me a small question and I rambled on about it. I hope I partly answered what you meant me to answer.
Yeah, no, that was not rambling at all. I think that really hits the nail on the head. That it takes organization and it takes many voices from different walks of society to create the kind of change that we're talking about here. Multiple points of intervention. I should ask Derek about time. I think he had given me permission for a few minutes grace.
That's right. Yeah, you're welcome to keep going, and people can have their lunch as they choose, but probably enough time for another question or two.
Michael, there's one showing on the screen here that I'd like to address.
Please.
May I do that?
Please.
It says, why are government healthcare agents and dietitians so resistant to this information? I need to distinguish between dietary, whole of diet, and nutrients in pill form. For various reasons, a lot proof in principle. Julia and Jenny and I have been studying nutrients in pill form. But we don't really want to put the whole world on pills. I mean, what we need to do is improve our nutrient intake with improving the soil, having more nutrient-dense food, and getting people to make better selections. It's not just the farmers, folks, it's us. We have to be selecting whole foods. And you saw that horrible data that's just come out on children in the US. 2/3 of what they're putting in their mouths is basically micronutrient free. So the question of why is there resistance? A lot of the resistance is to the idea of using nutrients in, supplements, right? And I don't know why, but there is a resistance, nutrients in pill form. And you see these ridiculous articles appearing now and then about how don't take your multivitamins, vitamin C can kill you, ridiculous things. I mean, there's never been a significant adverse event to any of these balanced formulas that we've studied. Of course, the doses are healthy. They're all within a range that is not a mega dose. They're all below tolerable upper levels. So there's never been an adverse event. But people still just, they want, we had all these dietitians, I call them 1950s dietitians, who for years said, oh, just eat a balanced diet, dearie, and everything will be fine. And people still adhere to that, and they won't be fine, not for everyone. But yes, it is the place to start. But I think a lot of the resistance is because it's coming from people who have been studying nutrient supplements. I don't get it, but it's a really strong bias.
Here's a question. You talk about the need for more PIs.
Yes.
And the training of PIs. Have you thought about, or have you tried even a brief workshop for professional development workshop for prospective PIs? And could it be done online?
It could be. I don't know who would sign up for it right now.
Mm-hmm.
The article that we just published in the American Psychological Association journal with the long name is an attempt to get to clinical psychologists because they don't understand that this is within their scope of practice. This is not a biomedical intervention, teaching people the difference between whole foods and the importance of eating well, et cetera, for your brain. Maybe as a result of that, there would be a way to do an online workshop. But the Mooc that Julia has is certainly educational. Are you asking this question, Michael, or is it coming from somebody else?
I asked that one just because it just occurred to me.
Okay, because I think the missing link here is what skills does a principal investigator have to have? You have to have someone who's trained in clinical research, knows how to run clinical trials, et cetera. And that's not necessarily who's signing up for the Mooc, and it's not necessarily who's reading our APA article, et cetera.
Yeah, that was my precise thought, that you, having done this for your entire career, have bit by bit acquired all the different competencies, a whole constellation of competencies that are necessary to get to fund and to conduct and to disseminate this research, and all the networks that you've built and so forth. So it is a rather specialized, unique set of skills.
Well, I think that kind of set of skills is usually taught in graduate schools. And so my junior colleagues have to do that, I think. But we do need more people doing it. Now, a really wonderful question has just popped up from Arnold Voth. I'm going to switch gears here. Health Canada did at one time issue a warning against True Hope because of serious adverse events. Arnold, I hope that you read what the warning was, because what the warning was, and very few people actually went online to read it, was that people might not take their psychiatric medication. Yes, that's true. That is not an adverse event. And the clinicians who are using broad spectrum formulas use it to titrate down and decrease the medication load of people who are taking psychiatric medications. So, but it has to be done carefully. The Hardy nutritional people train doctors, and you can go online and learn about it. And I have no idea what the quality of the training is, but they're pretty sharp folks, so I hope it's good. And they support physicians who are willing to use micronutrients to decrease the need of medication. But think what that means. What it means is that a healthier brain is likely to need less medication. And that's why this is not an anti-medication comment. But wouldn't it be wonderful if our young children, before they ever were exposed to medication, if we could get them eating better and possibly taking micronutrient supplements, might we avoid medicating some people? Might they have a healthier lifestyle? Might they then, some of them end up saying, well, if that's important, maybe I should exercise more. Maybe I should do other things that are healthy for me. They begin to be aware of the importance of health. So the only people who are hurt by this are the pharmaceutical companies. You know, patients are happy, families are happy, and Health Canada did warn against it. But remember, more than half of Health Canada's money comes from pharmaceutical companies. At least that was true according to the Globe and Mail a few years back. So, you know, you have to put this in context. So thank you for bringing that up and letting me address it.
I'm still watching the chat box, but until another one comes, I'll take the liberty of just making a comment and a question. This one's more of a comment, I guess. I want to comment on, I guess, I don't know what it's called. Is it called gray power?
Oh.
The potential for people with gray hair, whatever our age might be, but particularly our older people, to actually be part of the big change. And we're talking about big, massive changes in society here. There was a comment earlier, way up at the top, it's off the screen now, saying, I wish I had heard this in medical school. He was class of 66, and it's too late now. And I just want to say, our experience here over the past 20 years with the Center for Integrative Medicine, which is in the medical school, one of the most amazing and biggest surprises for me has been the huge well of support that we have received from older physicians, precisely the people, the so-called 1950s physicians, precisely the people whom we thought would be the most resistant. And what I personally found is when you get them alone, and particularly sometimes they would support us after they'd already retired, or sometimes they do something as their last act before retiring. But I think there's enormous potential for physicians and other professionals within and beyond healthcare to use their voices in their older years, because they are respected for various reasons, each in their own profession. And I think just as we have a powerful potential lobby at the young end of the spectrum, I think we also have a powerful set of voices, potential powerful set of voices at the older end of the spectrum as well. I think a lot of the people, physicians that I've talked to say, you know, I've known this all my life, but it was just, you know, I was prevented from saying it, or I felt prevented.
Well, they would have suffered consequences. There's no question that when you, actually Julia Ruckledge used an expression the other day when I wanted her to do something, and she said, remember in New Zealand, the tall poppies get cut down. And I think there's a bit of that in Canada too. If you speak out too strongly, if you don't follow the party line. And, you know, I'll tell you a story that really hit home for me. And that was after I told you about the case of Andrew, because Dee Dee Maltman asked about it, and Dr. Rodway. And Dr. Rodway and I presented that at rounds in the hospital where Andrew had been an inpatient for 6 months, sorry. And we thought, well, those are the people who need to hear what happened to him and see how well he's doing. And we presented the slides and showed the graphs. And the head of psychiatry, who has never in my entire career there seemed to be able to come to any of the rounds I ever presented, he always had a conflict, was not there. And so there was a junior person who had not been in psychiatry very long who introduced me. And as we walked out of the room, I thought, here's someone who should be open to this. And I said, so Dr. So-and-so, are you interested in trying a nutritional approach with any of your other patients? I mean, look, this at what we showed you. And he said, it's not part of clinical practice guidelines. And the fact is, folks, nutrition will never be part of clinical practice guidelines, because as many people more senior to me, like Alan Francis, who headed the DSM-4 task force, has pointed out, the people who write the clinical practice guidelines in mental health are always overly funded by pharmaceutical companies. And we give the statistics for the most recent round in our book, because I'm not saying that they're corrupt human beings, but they have thrown their lot in with medication. That is to them the way to go. And so clinical practice guidelines are controlled for mental health, controlled by the pharmaceutical companies. They'll never take a look at the nutrition literature. So why was I telling you that story? It's a pretty negative way to end, isn't it?
I have found my experience with that has been, if it's a reality, even if it's a depressing reality, we need to understand the foundations of resistance. If we don't do that, we do so at our own risk.
That is
and yes,
true.
It's depressing. Phase 1 is depressing, but I think reality. I have found that it's necessary.
Yes.
That's been my experience.
Right.
Bingo. What do we see here? Oh,
right. I've heard.
Yeah.
I appreciate that suggestion. I came up earlier. I have heard of it. I have not yet seen it. I've got to write it down. But does it address mental health or only physical health? Can the person who put that up there tell us? Somebody yelled mental health. Did I hear that?
That was my neighbor actually yelling across the fence to his neighbor.
Okay. Mostly physical, diabetes and cardiovascular disease. Right. That's what, again, we wrote our book out of frustration because people were ignoring the brain. And we've been trying to get to some of the celebrities, so many celebrities, meaning, Hollywood types who I don't know, are coming forward and talking about their mental health issues. We'd like to get them to become aware. They're so aware of fitness below the neck, but nutrition above the neck, they're not paying attention to it. And so Forks Over Knives, I'm sure, is a very good documentary, but I'll bet it doesn't touch on mental health. It's not just mental health, by the way, it's cognitive health. And there are some very good studies, we cite some in our book, on cognitive decline. And, we don't have any terrific medications to treat dementia, but we sure have very good data on slowing of dementia with improved B vitamins. That's the VitaCog trial from Oxford University. The Mind series the Mind Diet series from Claire Morris shows very similar kind of effect. So everyone, it's, I get asked occasionally, who is this stuff relevant for? Nutrition and the brain. It's relevant for anybody, any age. I worry most about our children, but healthy junk food free diet would be deficient. There's a lot. Thank you, Arnold. You're asking another very good question. Where is the evidence that eating whole foods, you're not getting enough micronutrients? This is a very big controversial topic there, and it falls into two areas. One is that the nutrient density of our foods, is not what it used to be. And we cover some of that. You have to understand, a lot of the audience might not understand that we have to have at least 15 minerals in the soil for the plants to draw on them as they need them. And when they draw on those minerals, they can do something that you and I cannot do, and that is synthesize vitamins. So the plants synthesize roughly 15 vitamins. We come along, we eat the plants, or we eat the animals that eat the plants, and we end up with the full broad spectrum of vitamins and minerals. But our soil does not always have that amount of minerals anymore. And there's one of the reasons has to do with glyphosate, the primary ingredient in Roundup, but there are other reasons too, having to do with tilling the soil. And we give references in the book about regenerative agriculture, etc. So I can't go into it more now, but it's a very, very interesting thing. And thank you for thanking me, Karen. Should we go let people have a little bit of lunch?
I think we probably should. This has been a great start to what I hope will be a continuing conversation. Thank you once again, Bonnie, for sharing not only the science, but the stories. And I'm just going to hold a book up here. It's called Lead with a Story. And so thank you for leading. Thank you for leading with your stories, because they're so powerful and they sink in very deep.